Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of my series going over the movies and shows I watch in a given month. This time, I'm actually being a bit more punctual and proactive in getting this month's episode out, because last month I fell a bit behind with my work and had to combine the May and June video together. That isn't the case this time. With that, I'm here to talk about all of the movies and shows I watched in July. And as always, all of the media I'll be talking about has been ranked from worst to best, and you can otherwise track everything I watch on my Letterboxd profile. Before getting into the meat of things though, let me bring up the Beauty and the Beast remake, because while I was present in the room as my in-laws were watching it, my attention was focused upon my Switch since I was playing Skyward Sword HD in handheld mode. I would occasionally glance over at certain scenes and overhear some of the dialogue, but the game was what earned my time. I do have one observation on the movie that I found to be kind of funny to me though, which is that for some reason Disney had straight guy Josh Gad play their gay but not really gay version of LeFou, and then they had Luke Evans, a man who's actually gay in real life, portray their most alpha male, thirsty heterosexual character ever in Gaston. Do I have a problem with it? Not really. Other than that I don't particularly like Josh Gad as an actor, it just stuck out as something kind of funny to me. Take that as you will. But anyway, let's get into the actual ranking by starting with Space Jam: A New Legacy. I know everyone's been saying it, but this movie was such shameful garbage. It almost feels like everyone on board with the project had a collective goal to produce the most cynical, corporatized film imaginable. Not that the original Space Jam was a masterpiece, for I think that movie has a lot of problems on its own, but at least it had a purpose and a solid concept. In fact, if done well, I could still enjoy the idea of pairing up an athlete playing his or herself with the Looney Tunes. The problem here is that none of the producers or creative team seem to have any confidence that LeBron James and some of the most beloved cartoon characters in history could carry any modern significance. That's why, I imagine, Space Jam: A New Legacy was turned into an even bigger and more cringe flex of intellectual property than Ralph Breaks the Internet, with countless references to other Warner Brothers properties being shoved in without rhyme, reason, or even any ounce of entertainment value. It's honestly astonishing how much of this movie is founded upon reminders of so many other movies you'd probably rather be watching, with the film sometimes quite literally playing footage of other movies, only with Looney Tunes rotoscoped on top of the real actors. Granted, the only scene I genuinely liked was Wile E. Coyote being inserted into Mad Max Fury Road, but that's beside the point. Even if Space Jam: A New Legacy wasn't a creatively bankrupt amalgamation of pop culture references, it would still be an insufferable movie on its own. The comedic writing is so predictable and tone-deaf that I doubt even children would find this experience to be enjoyable. Not to mention that the film's messy visual language is just an eyesore to look at, with the assortment of lights and colors being tough on the eyes, and the character designs descending deep into the uncanny valley. But on top of that, the movie's story and generic quote-unquote be-yourself message ring hollow because everything surrounding them felt artificial. Perhaps if the team making this film cared, it could have been worth something. Alas, Space Jam is something that should have remained as a relic of the 1990s. The Looney Tunes deserve much better. Up next we have Snake Eyes. I don't really have much to say that's constructive, other than that it's boring. Snake Eyes takes what was a seeming blank slate of a character, at least for how he's been portrayed in the other two movies, and does him no favors by giving him a generic story that mashes up ninja and Yakuza tropes. Henry Golding was a perfect casting choice then, because he's just got an attractive allure to him, and can fill in those gaps devoid of personality. His potential to deliver was squandered by the fact that his character is a douchebag though. Without divulging specific spoilers, he conjures up pretty much all of the conflicts and consequences thereof in the story. Neither does he really answer for any of the negative actions he commits. But whatever, does the action at least satisfy? No. For the most part, the time that this crew spent coordinating seemingly complicated fight choreography was wasted on camera work that can hardly keep up with the performers. You'd think that a studio funding so much money into this would care enough to hire people who can keep a camera steady, but I guess that's what you get when you hire the director of R.I.P.D. I honestly see no reason to watch this, for you'll find much better variations on this type of narrative elsewhere, and ones that don't rely on having to set up future movies in a franchise either. Next we have Jungle Cruise. This movie really makes you feel like playing Uncharted, but really, I did want to like this. Jungle Cruise starts off on the right foot with its quirky character introductions and a delightful tribute to the Disneyland ride courtesy of Dwayne Johnson's barrage of dad jokes, but it all quickly cascades into a movie checking off the marks for how to imitate an Indiana Jones-styled adventure. Some of the ways in which it does check off those marks are effective, the likes of which are charming lead characters portrayed by even more charming people like Johnson, Emily Blunt, and Jack Whitehall, but their journeys are marred by one played-out cliche after another, while also pieced together with very obvious CGI. A lack of authenticity and danger makes the latter portions of this movie harder to sit through, on top of the decreased amounts of corny levity, leading me to not have as much fun later on. Jesse Plemons could have been an amazing villain if I simply cared about his character more, and then Edgar Ramirez and company were, as Jeremy Jahns also put it, just second-rate rejected designs for Barbossa and Davy Jones's crewmates in their respective Pirates of the Caribbean films. In most senses, Jungle Cruise lives up to its namesake, for as much as Dwayne Johnson's Frank hyped up the jungle to be a vicious, unforgiving place, the adventure feels unfortunately safe, produced, and fluffed up, much like an oceanic cruise. Following that up, we have Top Gun. I've gotta be honest, this didn't work for me. This was technically my second viewing, but I remember being so tired during my initial attempt in 2013 that I hardly retained anything from the experience. I was surprised then to discover that this highly popular and iconic relic from the 80s only has limited appeal, which was cut down by mediocre writing and dated tropes of the era. Take My Breath Away kinda ruined any chances of me getting into the romance, on top of the love scenes being awkwardly filmed and performed. The inciting incident was never quite enough to get me invested either. By the time more of the dramatic turns of events in Act 3 occurred, I had mostly lost interest. I can't say that I cared about what was happening in the climax either. The conflict just kinda came out of nowhere and didn't really have any context, other than that there needed to be an action-packed set piece to close everything out. Granted, the aerial cinematography and stunt work is all excellent for the most part, but Top Gun unfortunately falls into the category of a YouTube movie for me. I may be inclined to watch footage of the dogfighting scenes, the most iconic quotes, and perhaps the beach volleyball game, but the connective tissue between all of those elements wasn't enough to make them stick for me. Sorry. Next we have Black Widow. I'll have more thoughts to share for this one in an upcoming video, but to be short of words, I was not a fan of this one. Even when I sat in a nearly packed IMAX theater with Justin, I felt underwhelmed by the experience this gave me. Part of that could be owed to the fact that since Black Widow serves as an interquel, the fairly standard spy thriller narrative felt more played out since we already know the main character's fate going into it. The goal should have been to delve deeper into her psyche and provide her with more needed closure, and that is what the film tries to do, but it doesn't accomplish more with that character than other Avengers and Captain America movies already have. Really, in my personal headcanon, Black Widow serves two key purposes. The first being to be a mediocre placeholder movie that Marvel felt forced to make by their fanbase, and the other being to establish characters for future movies and Disney Plus shows. The latter is kind of funny to me because one of them in particular, Florence Pugh's Yelena, often upstages her on-screen counterpart and lead actress Scarlett Johansson. I can't say that I cared for the villains either, for Taskmaster was nowhere near as cool as their comic or video game counterparts, and Ray Winstone somehow gave us an even more annoying weasel of a villain than oh well, this could have been so much better, especially given how long we had to wait to see it come to fruition. After that, we've got the Tomorrow War. Look, I'm well aware of the fact that the Tomorrow War is generic, dumb, and even conceptually broken at times, but I somehow managed to have more fun with it than most blockbusters this year. I attribute a lot of that to the first half. Up to that point, the story had actually done a decent job at establishing what was at stake. The threat to the key characters as well as humanity at large was made very clear, while also veiled enough to maintain my interest. And then once the action truly begins after the time jump about 40 minutes in, there was a visceral intensity present that I could appreciate. It helps that the creature designs were suitably scary, and Hollywood should normalize having animators direct movies. These people know the importance of framing and storyboarding action scenes. Not that the action in this was on par with something from Mission Impossible, but the sequences were serviceable and at least easy to follow visually. Where the film does fall short is that the second half suffers from some tonal and structural problems. Once a certain character shows up halfway through, it shifts the emotional core of the story to a much better place, but but the goals for wrapping up the conflict were much less logical and investing. That was especially the case when the story reached its emotional climax about 90 minutes in, and then went on for another 40 minutes. The last act simply just doesn't work in relation to what came before, especially since the foundation of what takes place honestly makes little logical sense. At least some of the action towards the end was enjoyable, dumb fun. You can't argue with J.K. Simmons wielding massive guns and looking like Stephen Lang from Don't Breathe. Ultimately, this was fine enough to watch one time on streaming. I don't know if the impending sequel will be justified, but whatever. Mega corporations like Amazon only listen to the money and numbers, not the ramblings of disgruntled YouTubers like me. Next we have Censor. To be fair, I appreciate the heck out of this indie horror debut from Welsh filmmaker Prano Bailey Bond. It also helped that the audience I watched it with just happened to be a mostly cultish group of people who consistently come to a Tuesday night series of horror movies at the local Alamo Drafthouse. Watching a movie with a crowd genuinely invested in the movie-going experience always makes it all better. Now as for the film itself, the lead actress was excellent at selling the bottled-up trauma nestled beneath her character, which the film itself also does a fair job at setting the stage for. I just don't feel like there was a powerful enough release of the tension at the end. A lot of the conclusions drawn in the third act just kind of felt like the more obvious plot developments you might expect to see about halfway through. Despite the creepiness of the ending, I wish I just felt its impact more, unlike how the tonally similar but much more effective Saint Maud did for me early in the year. Like other people have said though, I'd be eager to see what the director comes up with next. She clearly has a love for this genre and has great potential for her future, especially given how conceptually inventive and visually accomplished it was. After that, we have Old. Old is one of the more legitimately entertaining movies Shyamalan has made in a while, although that comes at the expense of some truly baffling choices with dialogue and cinematography. The nauseating 360 spin shots were one thing, but many times I simply could not make sense of how he'd block the actors for a shot, and then choose to focus on something else with the camera. Visuals tell as much of a story, if not more so, than the written and performed word when it comes to film, so there was a definite disconnect there. I can't say that some of the character interactions felt all that natural either. But with that being said, some say that the concept wears thin after a while, but I would actually disagree. I liked the pace that kept the film moving forward, and it was interesting to see how Shyamalan would keep mounting tension in a slasher movie style without making the thrills too goofy. And even though the dialogue itself could have used a lot more work, the concepts behind each character and how they relate to the movie's central themes were at least cohesive, compared to how the endings of other Shyamalan movies contextualize their stories. I actually liked the direction taken here. It had something to say without providing nonsensical explanations or cheapening the thrills from before. At least that's how I saw it, others may disagree. Old is a flawed experience to be sure, but I think this director's worst days are behind him. Next we have Wrath of Man. The irony of Wrath of Man is that it's the least Guy Ritchie movie that Guy Ritchie has made in years, and yet it's probably his best movie in years. Do I have an answer for why that's the case? Not really. I just know that Amber and I really enjoyed watching actors who are great at playing grizzled hard cases do their thing, most especially Jason Statham. It helps that the dialogue was insanely macho in the first half, getting me invested in the testosterone-fueled vibe which the movie was giving off, even as it later ventured off into non-linear and somewhat convoluted narrative paths. It eventually came back around for an intense and satisfying climax though, which thankfully featured none of the nauseating filmmaking techniques utilized in other recent Guy Ritchie movies. The gritty shootouts were carefully filmed and edited to keep the viewer on pace with what was being shown on the screen, and the end result was equal parts exciting and hard-hitting. Overall, this was a surprisingly fun movie, which is something I can't say for a lot of what I've watched this year. And after that, we have The Last Samurai. Even though large-scale historical epics are nowhere near as common as they used to be, the rare one gets released every now and then. The Last Samurai from 2003 just so happens to be a good one. It was my friend Jared's turn to pick a movie that we would all watch together, and my friends and I couldn't go about 3 to 5 minutes without making some reference to Ghost of Tsushima or any other samurai-inspired media as this movie played out. Otherwise, I can't say any aspect of this film really surprised me, but it makes up for that with strong acting and production value. Telling a story like this is benefited by filming it on location, casting a ton of extras, and striving for authenticity. And it was welcome to witness that while also admiring the lush cinematography and epic as usual score from Hans Zimmer. The effort must have been painstaking for the cast and crew, but the beauty of the end product speaks for itself. As a story, it's uncertain how long The Last Samurai will stick with me, but it does its job particularly well nonetheless. And then the first of 2 TV shows I watched in July was Demon Slayer. Yeah, I'm late to the party. I figured it was time to get into this after Mugen Train annihilated pretty much every other movie that was released at the height of the pandemic, both in terms of critical and financial success. Now that I've seen all of Season 1, you could consider me a fan, although it did take a little while towards the beginning for me to get fully invested. This is an anime, much like other shonen series, that relies a little bit too heavily on voiceover narration, overdramatic music, and shouting to get its points across. I'm looking at you, Zenitsu. It wasn't really until the trio of main characters came together that I grew to really appreciate it, and the entire arc with the spider demon family was incredible. The season then ends on a fairly disappointing note, as though episode 9 was the awesome climax, and then it goes on for another 7 episodes, with the very finale being set up without much payoff. Were it not for the fact that the show was as successful as it is and we got more material, the ending of this season would have left a much more sour taste in my mouth, given that its purpose is not to provide a temporary resolution, but rather to establish future storylines. Even so, the animation is spectacular, the action scenes do not hold back from depicting harsh violence, and it always felt like there was something genuinely at stake. Season 1 also did a great job at building out this fascinating horror fantasy world that I'm eager to see more of, and despite how irritated I got by his inner thoughts earlier on in the season, Tanjiro more than earns his salt as a likable protagonist. Looking forward to watching Season 2 once it's fully available. And then back to movies, I watched Tombstone. What Jared and I were delighted to discover is that Tombstone, a cult classic western from 1993, is one of those "hey, it's that guy" movies. You can't go 2 scenes in this film without taking a close look at an actor's face and then saying, "hey, it's that guy." It's such a great cast and a very fun western that gave me everything I needed. The interesting thing about it is that you don't really get the inciting incident until almost an hour into the story, but the film is hardly a bore prior to that point. Rather, there's a deliberate establishment of tension that comes from well-defined character dynamics and relationships, which comes from taking time to let the characters get to positions where the potential drama could then manifest. And then once it all heats up to the boiling point, everything becomes wickedly entertaining. We both ate this up from that point forward, appreciating the raw entertainment value, while also admiring the craftsmanship and the on-location cinematography that was proudly filmed in our home state of Arizona, along with the magnificent score that pulsated epically from beginning to end. Oh yeah, and Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday was as awesome as everyone says he was. He could be my gunman anytime. Man, what a fun movie. I look forward to watching this again sometime soon. And then pivoting back to TV shows, I watched Loki. Just like with Black Widow, I'm reserving some of my thoughts for a video I have in the works. But for now, I can at least say that this is the best thing Marvel has done post-Endgame, and in pretty much an all-encompassing sense. The visual language of this whole show is accomplished in such a way where the visual effects actually feel tangible and well integrated with the real-life sets and actors. Despite a more muted color palette with harsh yellows and browns, the overall look of the show is punctuated by art direction that is much more defined than most of what Marvel Studios has even made. Such could also be said about the euphoric electronic music that keeps the show on an uneasy level where you can't quite predict its narrative trajectory. But on that note, it was just a fun, engaging story whose time travel mechanics were admittedly a bit wonky, but such things didn't inhibit my enjoyment. Somehow they took what is already one of the most compelling characters in this franchise and gave Tom Hiddleston even more meat to chew on by peeling away his humanity tucked beneath the outward expressions of villainous intent. And watching all of the interactions he has with the other characters, Owen Wilson's Agent Mobius being a standout, is much more fascinating than most people give the series credit for. I think people often get the word boring associated with scenes of characters talking, but something is only boring if conversations between characters do not lead anywhere interesting. Such is the same with real life, you know? These conversations are fun because they're either founded upon person-to-person conflicts, or they're instances of individuals trying to unlock the mysteries of the other person. So in other words, I wasn't bored by the first 3 episodes and then taken in by the second half. I was engaged from start to finish, and so was my wife. What Season 1's ending implies for the MCU at large is admittedly overwhelming to me, but I'm optimistic for what the future has in store because this was a lot of fun. And now we come to a movie based on a TV show, which is Demon Slayer Mugen Train. I have my problems with Season 1 of this show, and while some of them did carry over to the theatrical film that serves as its almost immediate sequel, I otherwise found a lot to love. Much of that could be chalked up to the fact that Mugen Train has a terrific sense of pace, backed up by an effective story to boot. And what I feel was the true finale to Season 1, coming fresh off episode 26 of the show, made for a terrific experience that greatly deepens the dynamics of its main characters. But beyond that, it's just a beautiful, awe-inspiring delight of action-packed anime, particularly once the more horror-themed first act is complete. That's especially true in the final 30 minutes. I read a quote recently that basically said one's story is saved by the third act. Mugen Train was very entertaining up to that point, but one could argue that Acts 1 and 2 were just a contained selection of the show's episodes put to the silver screen, similar to how the 2008 Clone Wars movie was. What then transpires in the final act takes what came before and amplifies it all to infinity. The action, animation, music, emotion, everything. More importantly, this film is a solid testament to the mythos of true heroes. Without divulging spoilers, what the film has to say through its characters Tanjiro, Inosuke, Zenitsu, and most especially Rengoku speaks volumes to why we fall in love with fictional people. The greatest of all heroes are born from strife and bow not to the easy choices when presented to them. Let's just say this movie hammers home such themes with immense emotional power. Along with the sorts of treatises on the human spirit one could only dream of putting to words. Despite having cringe-worthy elements of anime and other clumsy storytelling devices that carried over from the show, this movie was an absolute blast. The Mitchells vs. the Machines has serious competition for my favorite animation of 2021, and I'm kicking myself for not having watched the show in time for me to catch this in a theater. But now I present something completely different to you in Pig. To go into this expecting John Wick with pigs would be very unfair to the filmmakers and the film itself. There are similar beats, sure, and I don't mean to say that as a disservice to the John Wick franchise either, but Pig carves out its own identity through tone, characterization, and themes. Here, you will not find a tale of revenge executed by lead pumped into human heads, but rather a nihilistic and honest look into why people keep waking up every day and doing their daily work. It's not all depressing and grim though, for the performances and humanistic flourishes in the storytelling keep things hopeful enough to resonate positively over time. For all the pain that is present in the world, we all try to process it differently, and this presents a story of people who try to connect through food, artistry, and holding on to whatever reminders they can obtain of simpler, sweeter times. Director Michael Sarnowski should be proud for making a debut this visually stimulating, raw, and moving. On top of giving Nicolas Cage a career best role, one in which he often disappeared into. Don't miss Pig. For any words I could offer up wouldn't do it proper justice, and it's otherwise a best of the year contender for sure. But even better than that is Pixar's Wally. This is such a wonderful work of art. Pixar was bold to think they could even top this and Ratatouille with all the films they've released in the years since. And while Wally is not quite on the same level of raw greatness once our couple of robot lovers leave Earth, never does it lose its emotional power, beauty, or sense of humor. In fact, the older it gets, the more prescient and meaningful it becomes. If you want to know more about how I feel on this one, feel free to check out my Pixar ranked video. But last but not least, we have The Sandlot. While I may have a tradition of watching Independence Day on, well, Independence Day, this time The Sandlot filled in the spot that is usually occupied by that film on this particular day. I felt compelled to rewatch this after Chris Stuckman's recent video, and then it just felt right to watch as it's the ultimate summer movie for me anyway. On that note, the story may not be that complex at all, but its simplicity and tinges of magic realism add up to something that reflects what a boy's ideal summer might look like. The stakes matter because, however low they may seem to the average person, they matter to the characters. The summer of 1962 is the biggest of their lives, and due to the memorable writing and even more iconic performances, we believe that. I wish my time with these guys didn't have to end, let alone be so brief, but I guess that's the point. All good things come to an end, but you never forget the joy you had in the moment and the memory sticks with you. I'm especially grateful that The Sandlot is a token of the past that hasn't lost its savor the older and more cynical I've become, and its nostalgic qualities and surprisingly strong filmmaking will keep me coming back to it for years to come. And that's it! Well, other than the book I read most recently, which was the manga adaptation of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. I've always been a massive fan of this series, but for the past month I've been like on a big Zelda kick. I've been listening to a lot of Zelda music playlists while writing scripts for my videos, I've been playing Skyward Sword HD as mentioned earlier, and then I read the graphic novel based on the first game in the series that I ever played. And wouldn't you know it, the book was both very nostalgic as a lifelong fan, but also a quality product on its own. While some elements of the game were glossed over quickly in the transition from an interactive story to a comic book, for the most part it retains the original story quite faithfully while also making some changes for the better, such as deepening the bond Zelda and Link shared as kids, as brief as it may have been. Ultimately, I would strongly recommend that a newcomer to the story of Ocarina of Time would be much better off experiencing the game first, considering that it's valued as one of the greatest games in history, and then read the manga once they're familiar with the material. Otherwise, thank you for checking out the latest installment in my ongoing series of videos going over the movies and shows I watch each month. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and then joining the notification squadron so that you don't miss out on my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great one.